Good evening and welcome. I am Kerri Culhane, and I'm the Associate Director of the Two Bridges Neighborhood Council. Two Bridges is a community-based nonprofit, and we are dedicated to improving the quality of life for all of the diverse residents of our Lower East Side neighborhood, as well as providing affordable housing. So Two Bridges neighborhood is squarely in Zone A, and for the most part, Lower Manhattan's waterfront was once part of the East River. And it's still very low-lying, and the made land barely rises above sea level. So in the 1990s, the city really began exploring ideas for a recreational waterfront to reconnect the city to the river. And Two Bridges and our partner organizations began working to engage residents in the area. And keep in mind that the majority of people who live here are renters. They may have lived in the neighborhood for decades and generations in many cases, but for the most part, they do not own a piece of that neighborhood, but it is their neighborhood and it is their community. And many residents feared that the recreational waterfront would accelerate the pace of gentrification in the neighborhood and lead to their own displacement. But then came the weather. So in 2011 and 2012, 2 years in a row, we had flooding in the neighborhood that was directly resulting from increased storm surge. The projections for the future only get worse, and I think we all can see that. So what happens? What do we do in this neighborhood where displacement from climate change is now as big of a threat, if not a greater threat, than the displacement from gentrification? So how do we both connect residents to the waterfront and keep them safe from threats of sea level rise? And I want to point out some dramatic photos that were taken in Knickerbocker Village in the neighborhood in literally the weeks after the storm, when people were still without power, still without light, still without heat, and many people trapped in their homes. So I approached our speakers with these questions. Is it possible, and on what scale, is it practical to deploy ecologically sound design or policy to mitigate adverse climate impacts on waterfront communities? And given that real estate interests drive the planning of the city, are there market-based solutions that we could look at that can be both ecologically sound and socially responsible, that do not result in the wholesale displacement of low-income populations or communities of whatever income? And so with that, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Cassim Shepard, the founding editor of Urban Omnibus.
Thank you, Kerri, very much, and thank you all very much for being here. Some of what Kerri just shared with us can be explored in further depth in a wonderful article that she wrote for Urban Omnibus this past August called Making Connections, Planning for Green Infrastructure in Two Bridges, which argues persuasively that the Two Bridges neighborhood is uniquely suited in terms of its architecture, its physical geography, the persistent threat and reality of devastating flooding, to retrofits that make the landscape more permeable, resilient, and connected both to its waterfront as well as to upland systems. And while this plan is specific to a neighborhood with a very unique set of urban conditions, it also serves to remind us of the neighborhood scale more broadly. And so with that in mind, I'm very much looking forward tonight to our distinguished guests, taking Two Bridges as a point of departure for a wide-ranging conversation that provokes questions about the role of neighborhoods and the role of design and planning in addressing climate impacts on waterfront communities throughout our city and region. I wish I could say to you tonight that we're here to discuss the merits of some one specific cohesive and coherent plan, but instead we are here to ask questions, to hear about a range of ways of thinking about these very complex issues.
We basically need to be thinking about how we transform infrastructure systems around the city in general. We need an overall strategy to make the city more ecologically productive, and of course I always refer back to this, wetlands acting as sponges. And for the Two Bridges group, we actually did a proposal for how to manage the stormwater in one of their buildings. They had this terrace that was a playground that wasn't used very much, and so we turned it into a more productive landscape space that could absorb water. We suggested taking water off of the street and into these sidewalk plantings that were along their site. Here you can see a plan of that project, and then also a view of what that would look like.
When you now look at have to look at waterfront zoning in terms of climate change, it feels now that maybe we're not thinking long-term enough, or we weren't able to at the time. and we can think differently now. But the balance between the investment in park is balanced by how we're making our edges. And the zoning, this is a little diagram to let you understand the trade-off. So there's a tension between doing these natural riprap edges and ceding space because you can't go out into the water because of current regulations, and doing a bulkhead, pushing up to the edge. And there's a lot of pressure. But from a point of view of environmental design, you lose when you have climate change because you've squeezed the room and you're in trouble.
In Bridgeport, I worked with the city, and we basically were working on a master plan for a community that's coastal that faces a lot of flooding issues. We mapped the flooding. We identified sub-basin watersheds within the neighborhood. We basically made the pitch that if you thought of your neighbor as your sub-basin watershed neighbor, and you could coordinate with together, you could actually construct green infrastructure that would be a collective system and cross property lines. Property lines are one of the fundamental challenges to coastal adaptation.
I do think, I agree with Alex very much, that people and communities have to be at the center of long-term planning and strategy. And this was seen in the days right after Sandy, that communities rallied. People came out, volunteers, Occupy Sandy, and filled the huge gap that was left by a government that was at all levels was incapable, just like Katrina, of dealing with the immediate aftermath of the storm.
I think first off, let's stick with the point that Tom just made about neighborhoods and people being at the center, and then perhaps each of you could say a little bit about how social infrastructure can inform ecologically sound design and planning practices in these coastal conditions.
Well, it's just that the current sort of tower in the park model allows for a lot of space that's open, but it tends to be lawn space and sidewalk space, and all of that lawn space tends to be fenced so that it becomes this little lawn museums. And I think if you just sort of erased the roads and the open spaces around the buildings and reconfigured some of that space and maybe thought about some selective removal of certain towers and a densification along other areas, you could actually come up with a much more productive landscape that provides both a greater density in certain areas, but also a greater productive landscape for, say, community gardens or agriculture or even, sponge parks or, landscapes that can actually start to soak up all the surface water runoff for a neighborhood.
I think the issue of connection and public space is critical. When there's an investment in a public space in the neighborhood, and that includes transportation, there's a greater connectivity between people living in the neighborhood, between access to where they go to school, access to work, buses. So I think the cutting off of less bus lines, and when people argue for no bike paths, or when there's an increase in, like on South Street, of using that as a byway for the FDR and just having as few lights as possible so that cars go, are all forms of kind of alienation from public space. Mm-hmm. And I would also argue that the 1950s and especially plans for housing where they become super blocks and they removed public streets, I think is one of the biggest problems in terms of understanding the value of the public space that's within the housing, but how those buildings could be really wonderful if they were actually connected up.
What would a democratic and expeditious process for making these kinds of decisions actually look like?
I think the community process is a critical process, but it's one that has many flaws. But I wouldn't say this is something that changes overnight, and it's there's always also the challenges of that, because there's people in the community that are very strongly opposed to certain things, and as you try to engage as many people as possible, it can be both good and bad, and the compromises become can be complex and challenging.
Lack of participation is not the problem. The problem is the institutions. In fact, I think there's an awful lot of participation, and there are a lot of opportunities for people to make their voices heard. You ever go to a public hearing? Everybody gets 3 minutes, and if it's at the city council or whatever public body is, half of the councilors aren't there, most of them aren't there. It's very frustrating. There's no real engagement with people's needs and desires. And we have institutions that should deal with these. The stronger that the city agencies get and the stronger the mayor's office gets, the weaker these institutions get within the overall decision-making process.
I have to make one comment just though in relation to Plan YC, because as a designer working sort of over the last 10 years, there has been a kind of night and day transformation of the relationship between formerly very siloed agencies that are now much more able to work together. That doesn't address the community issue, but there have been some really great benefits in terms of our ability to actually make change on an incremental level on these smaller projects. I mean, Claire mentioned a number of projects that I don't think they could have happened 15 years ago.
There's the issue of who gives permission to do what, which is one issue. But I think really underlying it all, we're talking about money. Things cost so much money. I think as a city, as a state, we have to think, why does it cost so much to repair a bulkhead? Why does it cost so much to do a rain garden? Why does it cost so much to build a bridge? Why does it cost so much to do green roofs? Is there a way we can start thinking about what we're really paying for there?
The revenue side of it is it does cost a lot, but why are so many tax incentives going to subsidize commercial mega projects instead of the necessary infrastructure?
Anyway, I've got a lot more questions to ask about this, but instead of doing so, I'm going to open this to the floor a little bit because I know people are eager to. Yes, please.
As designers, would you advocate that we keep the lines and design sponges, resilient habitat, better performative soft infrastructure only inwards? Or do we advocate for pushing those lines outwards, fighting the DEC, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Clean Water Act to create higher quality habitat than currently possible with bulkheads?
What is the possibility of gaining agency and power through rent strikes with the objective of creating land trusts and land trust cooperative ownership?
Well, just on the last question about ownership, slumlords in the Rockaways, Coney Island, and so forth. This is a really important question, I think, because the current system is leave it to the market. Why can't government get involved in using its powers to take over properties and turn them over to land trusts, to cooperatives, to community-based organizations and community development corporations? This requires money, of course, and aggressive action, which we don't see too much of now.
The city that we've constructed for ourselves is not really an ideal condition for human beings. I mean, we're all stressed out, and we've got a lot of environmental health risks, and there's a lot of tension. And the city has basically really been driven by a car. We have to move away from an idealized notion of nature. We're not living in that condition in an urban context, and we need to reimagine and evaluate what kinds of constructed ecosystems are going to be beneficial for us and are going to promote wildlife that might be something that is aesthetic for us, but that's also potentially functional.
Is there a potential fair share requirement for development along waterfronts or in communities that are clearly in Zone A and even in Zone B, and then tertiarily in Zone C, where they would have to chip in for the kind of infrastructure that would prevent or at least slow down this kind of problem, because I really don't want in 2013 to have to do what we did in 2012, which is rush everybody out by bus and then so on and so forth.
Is there the political will to build storm surge barriers to prevent or mitigate such conditions from happening?
I'm kind of new to studying the climate change, and I've just been trying to go through the IPCC reports and everything, and it seems to me that the estimates are rather conservative. I feel that the effects are happening much quicker than were anticipated, and I'm a little concerned that the planning that I'm listening to is too short term, and it's, you know, taking into account changes that might happen much more quickly.
I think it's relevant to start thinking about how other organisms on the planet deal with disturbance events, and how they their responses might influence or inform our day-to-day lifestyle patterns and our choices about what our expectations are.
We need to really think about insurance, and flood insurance in particular, and that, you know, perhaps over time we stop providing insurance for waterfront areas. And, you know, I don't want to say that people in waterfront areas, you know, will lose their money. I think we have to provide a payout. And I guess lately I've been thinking about how, you know, maybe that gets financed through development. You know, maybe what we do is actually provide for an upzoning of areas upland that can help to finance the payout of waterfront areas. I mean, it's almost like a carbon or a mitigation banking, but it's a development banking.
Why did actually people have to move out? Did they have to move out because there wasn't power? Did they have to move out because their windows weren't secure? Did they have to move out because, you know, you look at other larger institutions and their power kept going the whole time. So the investment in what already is a population that uses less carbon than other populations seems to be investing in making those buildings storm-proofed more so.
I'm leery of any scheme that leaves urban planning to the insurance companies. They'll do as good a job as they do with the healthcare system.
I live in Rockaway now. I lived through the hurricane. I watched 10-foot waves coming over the boardwalk. My neighborhood, well, first of all, the city was not there for us. It's not there for us now. And if it wasn't for the volunteers who came in from all over the country, we would be still underwater. You know, the storm wall that we had on the bay, on the beach in New Ponset and in Bell Harbor, they're gone. We have no protection. If there is a bad storm, we're going to be gone. So my question is there some temporary thing that we can do until the city or the federal government comes through with money to do something long term?
And I'd like the panel to comment on ways that the city can use its substantial resources to go after the root problem of all this. So three of those that I want to mention are divesting from fossil fuels and other destructive industries, reversing destructive activities of Plan NYC, like the switch over to natural gas and all the boiler systems that they're trying to push, and in a similar vein, halting the construction of things like the Spectra pipeline and the Williams Transco pipeline, which are both high-pressure gas pipelines going into the West Village and Rockaway, respectively.
I think that one of the things to take into consideration with climate change is that we are changing. Our understanding is changing, and what that means in my mind is that the opportunities that are very hard to sell today may be every day off the shelf in 10 years.
We have equal issues with how much waste gets trucked out of the city and how much money we spend on it. And it seems to me that those two are part of the answer of resiliency, both in terms of working jobs, where new industries are coming from, is that ideally that the answers the urgent questions, like how do we get a buffer in the Rockaways done quickly, that putting the right incentives to answer those questions might actually reap huge economic benefits all of these answers might end up being, like when New York used to be the oyster capital and our economy was going great gangbusters. It feels like the secret to our resilience as a city is in actually focusing on incentivizing people solving these problems and getting some of these out there.
I'll bet that if the city were to spend the same amount in the Rockaways as it's spending to subsidize building over the Hudson Yards, you'll get a solution. Not just a temporary one either.
What happened to the 26,000 sandbags that went around Goldman Sachs? Why don't we bring those to the Rockaways? Where are they? I don't know. That's a completely ignorant question, but that's like one of the sort of immediate fixes that you can do for protecting your property is to sandbag. And it's very low tech, but it's possible. But I think one of the other issues that was proposed in the MoMA exhibition was the idea of inflatable barriers, inflatable islands that could be used as almost like an island to replace the barrier islands that you had that were washed away. But you might want to think about the development of dynamic barriers that start during one of these cycles, but may distribute resources over a longer period of time. If you can put in, say, this sounds really simple, but if you put in a gigantic pile of sand, the currents will take it and distribute it to create a new barrier island if it's placed in the right location. This is something that was described in Tracy Metz's book, Salt and Sweet, and they're doing it in the Netherlands. And it's a quasi soft hard infrastructure engineered approach, but it's something that takes into account the natural systems in which we live. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about, and I think that's something that Alex was really referring to. We need to think about how our cities act in sync with the environment.
Final thoughts?
That was my final thought.
Kerri?